This 1863 soldier's portrait looks patriotic, until you notice the paper in his boot. This 1863 soldier's portrait looks patriotic until you notice the paper in his boot. At first glance, it seemed like any other Union portrait from the Civil War, the kind found by the thousands in attics and antique shops across America. A young man in blue, rifle at his side, chin lifted with quiet defiance. But one detail refused to let the woman studying it look away. A folded piece of paper, barely visible, tucked into the top of his right boot. Dr. Marin Caldwell had been cataloging Civil War photographs for the Tennessee State Museum for 11 years. She had earned her doctorate from Vanderbilt with a dissertation on the material culture of Union-occupied Nashville. And she had spent the years since in the museum's basement conservation lab, surrounded by the artifacts of a war that had transformed her home state. She had seen ambrotypes of boys who looked too young to shave, tintypes of officers posing with sabers they would never swing in battle, and faded carte de visites sent home to mothers who would outlive their sons. She knew the grammar of Civil War portraiture, the standard poses and backdrops and props that photographers used across the country. But this photograph, purchased at an estate auction in Murfreesboro, stopped her cold. The image was a quarter-plate tintype, slightly tarnished at the edges but otherwise remarkably preserved. The soldier stood against a painted studio backdrop showing a stylized American flag draped over what appeared to be a cannon barrel. His uniform was Union infantry, the brass buttons catching the photographer's light. His kepi sat at a slight angle. His Springfield rifle rested in the crook of his arm, barrel pointed upward in the traditional pose of martial readiness. Everything about the composition said patriot, said volunteer, said defender of the Union. Except for the paper. Marin adjusted her magnifying loupe and leaned closer. The document was folded into a narrow strip, perhaps 2 inches wide and 4 inches long. It had been inserted into the top of his right boot, just above the ankle, positioned so that a corner of it remained visible to the camera. At first, she wondered if it was an accident, some scrap the young man had forgotten to remove before posing. But the more she studied the image, the more deliberate the placement seemed. His right foot was angled slightly forward, as if to ensure the paper remained in frame. His expression, too, struck her as odd, not the stiff solemnity typical of wartime portraits. There was something watchful in his eyes, something guarded. Marin had catalogued more than 4,000 Civil War photographs in her career. She knew what soldiers looked like when they wanted to project courage for the folks back home. This man did not look courageous. He looked like someone keeping a secret. She turned the tintype over carefully, holding it by the edges. On the reverse, someone had written in faded pencil, J. Tolliver, Nash, 1863. Below that, in a different hand, older and more cramped, B. Detach, 14. The second notation meant nothing to her. The first, however, was a start. She photographed the tintype front and back with her digital scanner, then placed it gently into a padded archival box. That evening, before leaving the museum's basement conservation lab, she pulled up the 1860 and 1870 census records for Davidson County. There were 17 Tollivers listed in 1860. By 1870, the number had dropped to 9. War, disease, migration, the usual reasons people disappeared from the historical record. None of the surviving Tollivers matched the initial J. She tried Rutherford County next, since the estate sale had been held in Murfreesboro. 3 J. Tollivers appeared: James, age 47 in 1860, a farmer; John, age 22, listed as a laborer, and a third entry that made her pause. Josiah, age 16, colored, an enslaved teenager listed as property in the household of William R. Tolliver, a merchant. Marin sat back in her chair. The soldier in the photograph was young, certainly. His skin tone in the tintype was ambiguous, as it often was in images from that era. Tintypes did not render complexion accurately. Many black soldiers in Civil War photographs appeared lighter than they were in life, while many white soldiers appeared darker. Photography in 1863 could not be trusted to tell you who was black and who was white. But if this Josiah Tolliver had somehow escaped enslavement and ended up in a Union uniform, what was that paper in his boot? And why had he wanted it visible? She needed help. Dr. Leonard Price was a professor of Civil War history at Fisk University, just a few miles from the museum. He specialized in the United States colored troops and had spent decades researching the roughly 20,000 black Tennesseans who had served in Union regiments during the war. When Marin emailed him a scan of the tintype, he called her within the hour. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "Estate auction, Murfreesboro. It was mixed in with about 30 other photographs from the same collection. The others are all standard Union portraits, nothing unusual." "But this one has the paper." "Yes." Price was silent for a moment. "The notation on the back, B detach, 14. That's not a unit designation I recognize, but the phrasing is familiar. During the occupation of Nashville, the Union Army organized black laborers into what they called labor detachments. Sometimes they were numbered, Detachment 1, Detachment 2, and so forth. They built fortifications, repaired railroads, dug trenches, thousands of men, most of them contrabands." "Contrabands," Marin repeated. The word had a specific meaning during the Civil War. Enslaved people who had escaped to Union lines or who had been seized from Confederate slaveholders were classified as contraband of war, a legal fiction that allowed the Union to refuse, returning them to their enslavers without formally declaring them free. "The laborers were supposed to be paid," Price continued, $10 a month, sometimes less. In practice, many of them were never paid at all. They were worked like mules, housed in open fields, given scraps to eat. When the fortifications around Nashville were completed in late 1862, hundreds of those workers had died. Exhaustion, exposure, disease. The Army kept almost no records of their names. They certainly didn't record their deaths." Marin looked again at the scan on her screen. "You think this man was a laborer first, before he enlisted?" "It's possible. The USCT regiments didn't start recruiting in Tennessee until September 1863. Before that, black men who wanted to fight for the Union had no official path to do so, but they could be put to work. Many were, and the ones who survived long enough to see recruitment begin, some of them enlisted the day the recruiting stations opened." "What about the paper? Any idea what it could be?" "That's what worries me," Price said. Contraband workers were sometimes issued documentation, not freedom papers exactly, more like work permits, passes. They showed that the bearer had been assigned to a particular labor detachment and was authorized to move between work sites without being arrested or impressed again. Some of those passes were handwritten. Some were printed forms with blanks to be filled in. "So he's showing the camera his pass." "Maybe, or maybe he's showing something else. I'd need to see the original. And I'd need to find out what happened to the labor detachment records, if any survive." Marin drove to Fisk the following week with the tintype wrapped in acid-free tissue inside a padded case. Price met her in his office, a cramped room whose walls were covered with framed photographs of black soldiers and maps of Tennessee's Civil War fortifications. He examined the tintype under a jeweler's loupe for nearly 20 minutes before speaking. "The uniform is authentic," he said. "Regulation Union infantry, probably issued in late 1863. The rifle is a Springfield Model 1861, standard for infantry at that time. The kepi has no corps badge visible, which is consistent with a soldier photographed soon after enlistment. Everything about this says he's a legitimate Union soldier." But the paper. Price pointed with the tip of his pen, careful not to touch the image. "Look at the way it's positioned. He didn't forget it was there. He wanted the photographer to capture it. He's standing with his weight shifted slightly forward, his right boot turned to catch the light. This was intentional. Why would a soldier want to be photographed with a work pass? Because for some men, that pass was the only proof they had ever existed as anything other than property." Price set down the loupe. The contraband labor system was brutal. Men were impressed off the streets, pulled from church services, taken from their families with no warning. They were promised wages that never came. When they died, their bodies were buried in unmarked graves, and their names vanished from the record. If this man had survived all of that and then enlisted as a soldier, that piece of paper might have been the only evidence that he had endured something the Army wanted everyone to forget. The Tennessee State Library and Archives held records from the military governor's office during the occupation of Nashville. Andrew Johnson, before he became Lincoln's vice president, had overseen the city's transformation into a Union stronghold. Among the papers in the collection were reports from the Army's Engineering Corps, including Captain James Morton, the officer who had supervised the construction of Fort Negley, the largest inland stone fortification built during the Civil War. Fort Negley was not the only fortification that relied on black labor. Across Tennessee, from Memphis to Chattanooga to Knoxville, tens of thousands of contrabands worked on Union military projects. They built forts, repaired railroads, constructed bridges, and dug trenches. They served as teamsters, cooks, hospital workers, and personal servants to officers. The Union Army could not have sustained its occupation of Tennessee without them, but the labor system was, in many ways, a continuation of slavery by other means. The workers were classified as contrabands, a legal category that placed them somewhere between enslaved and free. They could not be returned to their former enslavers, but they were not citizens either. They could be impressed into service against their will. They could be worked without pay. They could be separated from their families. And when they died, their deaths were not recorded in any official casualty list. The irony was bitter. The Union Army was fighting to end slavery, yet its own labor policies exploited black workers in ways that differed from slavery only in legal technicality. The men who built Fort Negley were not called slaves. They were called laborers. But they worked under armed guard, slept in the open air, received inadequate food and no medical care, and had no legal recourse when the wages they were promised never arrived. Marin spent 3 days in the archive reading Morton's correspondence. The captain had been obsessed with speed. Confederate forces were expected to attack Nashville at any moment, and Morton needed the fort completed before they arrived. His letters to superiors complained constantly about the shortage of labor. "Only 150 Negroes so far," he wrote in August 1862. "I wanted to employ 825 by the 11th. The Army's solution had been impressment. Union cavalry surrounded Nashville's 3 black churches and arrested every able-bodied man they found, marching them to St. Cloud Hill with picks and shovels. Some were enslaved men whose owners had fled the city. Others were free blacks who had lived in Nashville for years, working as barbers, blacksmiths, and carpenters. The Army made no distinction. If you were black and strong enough to lift a stone, you were put to work." By December 1862, when the fort was completed, between 600 and 800 of those workers had died. Exposure, accidents, disease. Their names appeared on no casualty lists. Their families received no death benefits. Their graves, if they had graves at all, were unmarked. Marin found a partial roster of the labor detachments in a folder of miscellaneous papers. It was not a formal military document, but a handwritten list, apparently compiled by a quartermaster's clerk attempting to calculate wages owed. Detachment 14 was listed with 23 names. Most were first names only, sometimes with ages or physical descriptions. Samuel, Abter 30, tall. Moses, young, lame, arteet leg. Near the bottom of the list she found Josiah T., Abter 18, literate. Literate. In a system that had deliberately kept enslaved people from learning to read, that single word carried enormous weight. A literate black man in 1862 Nashville was dangerous. He could forge passes. He could write letters that might reach the Northern press. He could read military orders and understand what the Army intended to do with him. She cross-referenced the name with the USCT enlistment records. On September 20th, 1863, a man named Josiah Tolliver enlisted in the 14th United States Colored Infantry at Nashville. His age was listed as 19. His prior occupation was listed as laborer. In the space for remarks, someone had written, "Previously employed on fortifications." Price confirmed the connection when she showed him the documents. "This is almost certainly the same man," he said. "He survived Detachment 14, waited for the recruiting stations to open, and enlisted the moment he could. He went from being an unpaid laborer to being a soldier, with a salary, a uniform, and legal standing as a member of the United States Army." And the paper in his boot? His contraband pass. The document that proved he had been assigned to a labor detachment rather than simply wandering the streets. Without that pass, any white soldier or civilian could have accused him of being a runaway and had him arrested, or worse. That piece of paper was his lifeline. and when he had his portrait taken, he made sure it was visible. Why? Because he knew what the army had done to his detachment. He knew how many men had died building that fort without anyone recording their names. He wanted evidence, proof that he had been there, that he had survived, that the system had tried to erase him and failed. The 14th USCT had seen action at the Battle of Nashville in December 1864, one of the largest engagements involving black troops in the war. More than 13,000 USCT soldiers participated in the Union victory that shattered the Confederate Army of Tennessee. The battle was a turning point, not only for the war, but for the soldiers themselves. They had been told they could not fight. They had been told they lacked the courage and discipline of white soldiers. At Nashville, they proved those assumptions wrong. The USCT regiments attacked Confederate positions on Overton Hill with fixed bayonets, advancing uphill against entrenched defenders. The casualties were heavy, but they did not break. They held their ground, pushed forward, and helped deliver one of the most decisive Union victories of the war. For the men who had spent 1862 and or 1863 digging trenches and hauling stones, the battle was a transformation. They were no longer laborers, they were soldiers. They had rifles in their hands and enemies in their sights. Josiah Tolliver's service record showed that he had been present for the battle. He had survived. But the same army that had accepted him as a soldier still refused to acknowledge what he had endured before his enlistment. But his story did not end there. After the war, Tolliver filed a pension claim with the Bureau of Pensions in Washington. The claim was denied. The reason given was insufficient documentation of service-related disability. In his appeal, Tolliver wrote that he had suffered chronic pain in his back and legs from the labor he had performed at Fort Negley before his enlistment. He described working 16-hour days, hauling limestone blocks, sleeping in the open without blankets, and eating nothing but hardtack and water for weeks at a time. He described watching men collapse from exhaustion and being buried in shallow graves at the edge of the worksite. He asked the Bureau to consider his labor detachment service as evidence of injury incurred in the line of duty. The Bureau refused. Contraband labor, they ruled, did not count as military service. The injuries Tolliver had sustained while building the fort were not the government's responsibility. Tolliver died in 1891 in Nashville. He was 47 years old. His pension claim remained denied. When Marin presented her findings to the museum's curatorial board, the reaction was complicated. The director, a careful man named Howard Strickland, listened to her presentation without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "This is significant research," he said, "but I'm not sure how we frame it for the public. The photograph, on its own, doesn't prove anything. You've built a circumstantial case connecting the tintype to this Josiah Tolliver, but we can't say definitively that the man in the photograph is him. The notation on the back says J. Tolliver. The estate sale was in Murfreesboro, 30 miles from Nashville. The detachment number matches. The timeline matches. I understand, but some of our board members are concerned about interpretation. If we present this as a straightforward Union soldier portrait with a hidden story, that's one thing. If we start talking about forced labor and unpaid wages and denied pensions, we're making a political statement." "We're making a historical statement," Marin said. "The contraband labor system existed. Hundreds of men died building fortifications for the Union Army without being recorded in any casualty list. That's not politics. That's fact. It's a fact that some people find uncomfortable. We have donors who trace their ancestry to Union officers. We have school groups that come here expecting to see heroes. Josiah Tolliver was a hero. He survived forced labor, enlisted in the Army, fought at the Battle of Nashville, and spent 26 years trying to get the government to acknowledge what he had endured. If that's not heroism, what is?" Strickland sighed. "I'm not saying we bury the story. I'm saying we need to think carefully about how we tell it. There's a difference between the Union Army built forts using volunteer black labor and the Union Army impressed black men at gunpoint and worked them to death without pay. Both statements can be technically true, but they create very different impressions. The second statement is more accurate. The second statement is more likely to end up on cable news with someone accusing us of revisionism. Dr. Price, who had joined the meeting at Marin's request, leaned forward. With respect, Mr. Strickland, the revisionism already happened. It happened when the Army decided not to count contraband deaths as casualties. It happened when the Bureau of Pensions rejected claims from veterans who had been injured as laborers. It happened when textbooks described the Union's treatment of contrabands as humanitarian without mentioning the impressment and the unpaid wages and the unmarked graves. What Dr. Caldwell is proposing isn't revision, it's correction. The debate continued for 3 months. Marin found allies on the curatorial staff, particularly among the younger researchers who had been trained to center marginalized voices in their work. She also found resistance from board members who worried about controversy, about donor relations, about the complexity of presenting a story that implicated the Union Army in exploitation. In the end, a compromise was reached. The tintype would be displayed in a new exhibit on Black Tennesseans in the Civil War, alongside other photographs of USCT soldiers and contraband camp residents. The label would identify the subject as believed to be Josiah Tolliver, and would describe his journey from enslaved teenager to labor detachment worker to Union soldier. The paper in his boot would be explained as a contraband pass, a document that protected its bearer from arrest while also marking him as a member of an exploited labor force. The exhibit opened in December 2022, on the anniversary of Fort Negley's completion. Among the attendees was a woman named Denise Tolliver Banks, who had driven from Memphis after learning about the exhibit from a cousin who had seen a news article about the museum's new display. She was Josiah's great-great-granddaughter, descended from a son he had fathered after the war with a woman named Clara, whose name appeared in the 1880 census as his wife. Denise stood in front of the tintype for a long time. Her eyes moved from the young man's face to his uniform, to his rifle, to the paper in his boot. She pressed her hand against the glass, as if she could reach through time and touch him. "We always knew he had been in the war," she said. "My grandmother used to talk about her grandfather, the soldier. She said he never talked about the fighting, but he talked about the fort. She didn't understand what he meant. None of us did. We thought he had been stationed at a fort like a garrison. We didn't know he had built one with his bare hands. We didn't know about the labor detachment. We didn't know he had been worked almost to death before he ever picked up a rifle." Marin stood beside her, watching the woman's face in the gallery's soft light. "Did your family keep any of his belongings? Letters, photographs, documents?" Denise nodded slowly. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper, browned with age and soft at the creases. "This was in a box of family papers we found when my grandmother died. We never knew what it was. My mother thought it might be some kind of receipt. I thought maybe it was a discharge paper. But it didn't match any of the military documents I could find online, so I put it back in the box. The paper was a contraband pass issued by the United States Army, authorizing its bearer, one Josiah Tolliver, to move freely between labor sites in the Nashville Military District. It was dated September 1862. It bore the signature of a Union officer whose name was illegible. And in the bottom corner, in faded pencil, someone had written, "B. Detach 14. Marin looked from the document to the photograph and back again. The same paper, the same man. The same piece of evidence that Josiah Tolliver had carried with him for more than a century, passed down through generations of his descendants, waiting for someone to understand what it meant. He wanted people to see it, Denise said. He wanted proof. Fort Negley still stands on St. Cloud Hill, overlooking downtown Nashville. In 2019, it was designated a UNESCO Site of Memory, one of only a handful of American locations included in the organization's Slave Route project. The designation recognizes the fort as a place where the legacies of slavery and freedom are inextricably intertwined, where the labor of enslaved and formerly enslaved people built a structure that would help win a war for their own liberation. The Visitors Center now includes information about the labor detachments, about the hundreds of men who died without being named, about the contraband passes that were their only protection against a system that saw them as tools rather than people. a database called Builders and Defenders, created by historians and descendants working together, attempts to identify every black worker and soldier associated with the fort. The project has recovered nearly 5,000 names so far. Each name represents a person who was real, who suffered, who endured, who deserves to be remembered. Josiah Tolliver's name is in that database now. So is his photograph, the tintype with the paper in his boot. Visitors to the site can see him as he wanted to be seen, not just as a Union soldier, but as a survivor. A man who had been worked nearly to death, who had watched others die beside him, who had kept a scrap of paper as evidence that the system had tried to erase him and failed. The Civil War produced hundreds of thousands of photographs. Soldiers posed in studios from Maine to California, holding rifles and sabers, wearing uniforms that would soon be stained with mud and blood. Most of those photographs show exactly what the subjects wanted them to show: pride, determination, patriotism, the faces that families wanted to remember. But some photographs contain something else, a detail that doesn't quite fit, a piece of paper where no paper should be, an expression that suggests the subject is not posing for posterity, but leaving evidence, a message hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see it. The contrabands understood something that the official records tried to obscure. They understood that their labor was essential to the Union war effort, even as that labor was exploited and their deaths went uncounted. They understood that the system which claimed to be liberating them was also using them. And some of them, like Josiah Tolliver, found ways to preserve evidence of what they had experienced, hiding it in photographs and passing it down through generations of their descendants. Josiah Tolliver knew that the Army would not record what had happened to Detachment 14. He knew that the men who died on St. Cloud Hill would be forgotten, their names buried with their bodies in unmarked graves. He knew that his own survival was an accident of luck and endurance, not a gift from a grateful nation. So he tucked his contraband pass into his boot and stood before the camera. He shifted his weight forward so the paper would catch the light. He held still for the long exposure, watching the photographer adjust his equipment, knowing that this image would outlast them both. And then he waited. For 160 years, he waited. For someone to notice the paper, for someone to ask what it meant, for someone to tell the story that the official records refused to tell. The next time you see a Civil War photograph, look carefully at the details, the hands, the feet, the objects in the background, the expressions that don't quite match the pose. Every photograph is a document, and every document is a choice. Someone decided what to show and what to hide. Someone decided what story the image would tell. But sometimes, if you look closely enough, you can see the story the subject wanted to tell instead, the story that the official narrative tried to bury, the story of the people who built the forts and dug the trenches and died without being counted. They left us evidence. All we have to do is look.